Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. There's something at home.
When my grandparents and my uncle moved to a larger city about a year ago, I didn't think much of it. The transition seemed practical. More space, better amenities, and a fresh start for them. My initial visits were brief, just a day or two at a time. It wasn't until my mother moved in with them that I spent an extended period at their new place, arriving for the summer with a plan to head back home afterward. The house was impressive in size, far bigger than their old place. It had 3 bedrooms, a spacious living room, and a couple of hallways that connected everything. As you walked through the front door, the living room was immediately to your left. Directly in front of you was a small hallway leading to my uncle's room. To the left of this hallway was another, longer corridor that led to my grandparents' bedroom and their office. The layout was straightforward, yet the house had a somewhat cold, impersonal feel to it. On my first real stay, I tried to get a sense of the place. It was nice enough, but something about the atmosphere just didn't sit right with me. It wasn't anything concrete, just a vague feeling of disquiet that I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off as part of adjusting to a new environment. My grandmother had insisted it was just an old house with character, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to it. It was during one of those early days at the new house that my grandmother told me about her strange encounter. She had been sitting on the sofa in the living room, facing the front door, when she noticed something unusual. She described seeing a tall, dark, and thin figure peeking its head around the door across from the front door. Her voice was shaky as she recounted the event, saying the figure didn't seem overtly malevolent, but something about it was deeply unsettling. I remember her words vividly. She said it was as if the figure was trying to be discreet, just barely making its presence known. Despite her reassurance that it didn't feel threatening, there was an undeniable edge of discomfort in her description. At the time, I didn't know what to make of it. I loved the darker and more morbid side of life, but I had always been a skeptic of anything supernatural. I chalked it up to her imagination running wild. Maybe she'd seen shadows play tricks or misinterpreted a passing car's headlights. It didn't help that I was already a bit on edge, trying to adjust to the new house and the unfamiliar surroundings. So, I brushed off her account, convincing myself that it was nothing more than a harmless figment of her imagination. A few nights after my grandmother's unsettling encounter, I found myself in one of the bathrooms, preparing for a shower. It was a small space with the shower door slightly ajar. As I brushed my hair, I noticed something strange. A large strand of hair at the back of my head was inexplicably lifted, almost as if an invisible hand was toying with it. I didn't think much of it at first. I was tired and chalked it up to a draft or maybe even my own movements. But as I was about to step into the shower, something happened that made my blood run cold. The shower door slammed shut with such force that it felt like something, or someone, had slammed it with the strength of an angry adult. The sound reverberated through the small room, and I was instantly enveloped in a shroud of icy dread. It was then that the sense of unease really settled in. I finished my shower, my mind racing, and when I stepped out, the oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to press down on me more than ever. As I sat in the living room afterward, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air felt heavier, charged with a negative energy that seemed to seep into every corner of the house, wrapping me in a suffocating blanket of dread. That evening, I found myself sitting in the same spot in the living room where my grandmother had her unsettling encounter. I was trying to shake off the lingering unease from the shower incident, hoping that my nerves would settle in the quiet of the room. The living room was dimly lit by the streetlights filtering through the curtains, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. As I tried to relax, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly, and there it was, the tall, dark figure my grandmother had described. It was standing just beyond the doorway, its presence almost blending into the darkness. Its silhouette was unmistakable, tall and thin, with an unsettling aura that sent a chill down my spine. The figure moved deliberately and slowly, its head peeking around the door with a careful, almost deliberate motion. It wasn't hurried or frantic. Instead, it was methodical, as if it knew I was watching and wanted to make sure I saw it clearly. Its presence was suffocating, and the longer I stared, the more the room seemed to close in on me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that it felt like it might burst through. The figure's gaze, or at least the sense of its gaze, was fixed on me, even though its face was obscured by the darkness. I felt as though I was trapped in a nightmare, the overwhelming dread almost tangible. It felt like hours, though I knew it was probably only around 30 seconds, before the figure started to shrink, crouching down out of sight. As it disappeared back into the hallway, I was left in a state of shock. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just a fear of the unknown, it was a profound sense of dread, as if something malevolent was lurking just out of reach, waiting to pounce. The weight of it pressed down on me, making me feel as though I was suffocating under the sheer terror of the moment. As the figure crouched and began to shrink away from view, it vanished into the hallway, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. I sat there, motionless, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The sight of the figure disappearing into the darkened corridor was both a relief and a source of profound confusion. My body felt as though it was encased in a vice of fear, unable to move or even breathe properly. The moment it disappeared, the air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. I could still feel the lingering presence of that figure, as if its dark energy had seeped into the very walls of the house. The dread that enveloped me was all-consuming, a constant reminder of what I had just seen. It was like a suffocating fog that refused to lift, wrapping itself around my senses and clouding my thoughts. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a hidden menace, every shadow a potential threat. The experience had shattered any remaining sense of security I once had in this house. It was no longer just a home. It felt like a place where something dark and malevolent lurked, waiting for the next opportunity to make its presence known. The fear had become a permanent resident, a shadow that followed me even when the figure itself was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that whatever had appeared to me was still out there, watching and waiting. The house, once just a large and unfamiliar space, had become a labyrinth of terror, where every creak and groan of the old building seemed to whisper of unseen horrors. The experience had left me with a deep-seated dread, a belief that the house harbored something supernatural that defied explanation, and a fear that the worst was yet to come.
The Triangle Head.
The abandoned playground on the outskirts of town had become our usual spot for Saturday night gatherings. Its eerie atmosphere, with creaky swings and a rusted slide overgrown with weeds, made it strangely thrilling rather than outright scary. We liked the isolation, far from the prying eyes of parents and nosy neighbors. It was our secret haven where we could talk, laugh, and just be ourselves. On this particular Saturday night, we gathered around a makeshift fire pit. The flames crackled and cast long, dancing shadows on the worn-out playground equipment. The night was chilly, and the fire provided a welcome warmth. We joked and exchanged stories, the camaraderie strong among us. Dave, our self-appointed leader, was in the middle of recounting a particularly funny incident from school when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and concern. We followed his gaze into the darkness beyond the firelight. There, at the edge of the playground, stood a figure. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow playing games with our minds. But as we continued to stare, it became clear that this was no illusion. The figure had a distinct shape, broad shoulders tapering unnaturally down to a narrow waist, giving it a triangular appearance. We laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as just another strange occurrence in our strange meeting place. "It's probably just a weird shadow," I said, though even I didn't fully believe my own words. Little did we know, the night was about to take a turn from thrilling to downright terrifying. Dave was the first to notice it. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, squinting into the darkness. His voice broke the casual chatter, drawing all our attention to where he was pointing. There, at the edge of the playground, stood a figure. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, an oddly shaped shadow. But as our eyes adjusted, it became clear that this was something, or someone, more tangible. The figure had an unmistakable shape, broad shoulders that tapered unnaturally down to a narrow waist, forming a disturbingly perfect triangle. "What the hell?" someone muttered. We laughed, nervously at first, brushing it off as some kind of optical illusion. "Probably just a shadow," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Then, the figure began to move. It started to dance, but not in any way I had ever seen before. It jerked and twitched, its limbs moving at odd angles like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. The movements were slow and deliberate, almost hypnotic in their grotesqueness. Our laughter died instantly. We watched, transfixed and horrified, as the figure's bizarre dance continued. It was as if it was trying to communicate something through those unnatural movements. The figure's skin, now visible in the flickering firelight, looked pale and waxy, almost plastic. Its eyes were dark and empty, void of any life or emotion. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The laughter had given way to an eerie silence among us. We were no longer in control of the situation. We were mere spectators to whatever unholy spectacle was unfolding before us. The atmosphere, once filled with camaraderie and warmth, had turned cold and menacing. The strange figure kept dancing, and we could do nothing but watch in growing dread. As the figure drew closer, more unsettling details came into focus. Its skin looked unnaturally pale, almost waxy, as if it were made of some synthetic material rather than flesh. The eyes, two dark voids, seemed to absorb the light from our fire rather than reflect it. The broad shoulders and narrow waist were no trick of the light. This thing was genuinely triangular in shape. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and disbelief. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, but the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The figure's dance became even more disturbing as it neared us. Each jerky movement seemed more deliberate, more calculated. It was as if the figure was savoring our terror, feeding off the mounting panic that now gripped us all. Its limbs twisted and contorted at impossible angles, moving with a fluidity that belied its puppet-like appearance. Then it stopped. Just like that, the figure froze mid-dance, its lifeless eyes locking onto ours. The silence was deafening, our collective breath held in fearful anticipation. The figure's head tilted slightly, and its mouth opened, releasing a voice that sounded like nails on a chalkboard, grating and unnatural. "Come dance with me." The words hung in the air, chilling us to the bone. In that moment, the reality of our situation hit us like a freight train. This was no prank, no illusion. This was something far more sinister and dangerous. Panic erupted among us. Without a second thought, we bolted, the sound of our frantic footsteps echoing in the night. As we sprinted away, the faint, eerie laughter of the triangular man followed us, his grotesque invitation still ringing in our ears. As soon as the figure's chilling invitation reached our ears, panic gripped us like a vice. We bolted, adrenaline surging through our veins. I could hear my friend's frantic breaths and pounding footsteps, matching the thunderous beat of my own heart. None of us dared to look back, terrified of seeing that grotesque figure gaining on us. The playground, once our secret haven, had transformed into a nightmare. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, feeding our desperation. The sound of the man's eerie, unnatural laughter echoed behind us, mixing with the sound of his distorted, puppet-like movements. It felt as though the very darkness was closing in, suffocating us with its weight. We reached our cars in record time, hands shaking as we fumbled for keys, yanking doors open and diving in. The engines roared to life, and we sped away, tires screeching on the gravel. The figure was nowhere in sight, but his presence lingered, an oppressive weight on our minds. As we tore through the streets, the familiar sights of the town brought a fleeting sense of relief. The streetlights, the houses, everything seemed to promise safety. Yet, the terror clung to us, a persistent reminder of what we had just escaped. When we finally reached the heart of the town, we pulled over, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. No one spoke for a long moment, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. The playground, once a place of innocent thrills, was now a place of unimaginable horror. "We can never go back there," Dave finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded in agreement, the decision unanimous and unspoken. That night, as I locked my doors and windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The triangular man, with his vacant eyes and eerie dance, haunted my thoughts. Sleep was a distant hope, replaced by the relentless replay of that night's events in my mind. From that night on, the playground became a forbidden topic among us. But the memory of the triangular man, his grotesque invitation, and the terror we felt remained etched in our minds, a haunting reminder of the unknown horrors lurking in the shadows. The experience at the playground changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Now, every night, I make sure all my windows are tightly shut and my doors are securely locked. What used to be a casual routine became a meticulous ritual. I double-check each lock, pull the curtains tight, and even set up makeshift barriers to give myself a sense of added security. But no matter how thorough I am, I can't shake the feeling that the triangular man is still out there. His grotesque form and haunting dance have embedded themselves in my mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside sends a jolt of fear through me. It's as if he's always watching, waiting for the right moment. The shadows cast by streetlights seem to flicker with his presence, and I catch myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. The rational part of my mind tries to dismiss these fears, but the memory of that night is too vivid to ignore. I've distanced myself from the friends who were there that night. It's too painful to talk about what happened, and I can see the same fear mirrored in their eyes when we accidentally cross paths. We all bear the invisible scars of that encounter, each of us coping in our own way. Some nights, I dream about the playground. In these nightmares, I'm back at the fire, and I see the triangular man approaching. His dance is slow and deliberate, and no matter how fast I run, I can't escape him. I wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of his eerie voice echoing in my mind, "Come dance with me!" Even in the waking hours, the sense of being pursued never fully leaves. When I walk home from work, I quicken my pace as darkness falls, feeling his presence in every alleyway and around every corner. It's a constant, gnawing fear that keeps me on edge. The playground has long since been abandoned by our group, and I've heard rumors that others have seen the same figure. But no one dares to go back and confirm. We've all learned our lesson. The triangular man remains a ghost story, a local legend whispered among the daring, but for me, he is all too real. Living with this fear has become my new normal. It's a heavy, oppressive weight that I carry with me. I just hope that one day, I'll be able to outrun the shadows and find peace. Until then, I'll keep my doors locked and my eyes vigilant, never forgetting the nightmare that began with a seemingly innocent night at an abandoned playground.
The scary old woman.
I've always been dedicated to my fitness routine, and my daily walks around the neighborhood were a crucial part of it. The quiet streets were perfect for my cardio, and I took pride in maintaining my well-toned physique. I wore my usual tight workout clothes, feeling confident as I walked for hours each day, lost in my thoughts. One crisp autumn morning, while I was on my usual route, I noticed an old woman sitting in a portable chair by the sidewalk. Her appearance was striking. She was dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, with a weathered face that seemed to tell 1,000 stories. At first, I dismissed her presence as just another eccentric local. I shrugged it off, assuming she was simply taking a break or enjoying the fresh air. But as the days passed, the old woman became a fixture on my walks. I'd see her in the same chair, always positioned a little closer to the path where I walked. Her gaze was unervingly intense, and it felt as though she was watching me with a disturbing curiosity. Her eyes followed me with a piercing focus, and I could sense something unsettling in her stare. I tried to ignore it, but her presence was impossible to shake off. With each passing day, her chair would be a bit closer to my route. It was as if she was deliberately moving it to get a better view of me. My initial discomfort grew into a deep unease. I started to feel like she was silently tracking my every move, and the strange feeling of being watched began to weigh heavily on me. The more frequently I saw her, the more intense her gaze became, fueling my growing discomfort. What had started as a minor curiosity now felt like an unsettling intrusion into my daily routine. At first, it was just an odd feeling, an inexplicable chill that settled in my spine whenever I passed by her. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started hearing something unsettling. Faint whispers drifted through the air, almost too quiet to make out. It was as if someone was trying to speak just out of earshot. I glanced over at the old woman, but her mouth remained closed, and her expression was as inscrutable as ever. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the wind or perhaps a trick of my imagination. But the whispers persisted, growing more distinct with each passing day. I could hear fragments of words, though they were still mostly unintelligible. The sound was like a soft, raspy murmur, accompanied by a tone that sent shivers down my spine. The whispers seemed to be coming from her direction, and the unease I felt began to turn into genuine fear. One day, as I approached her usual spot, the whispers became clearer. I could make out a few words. "Come closer," she said, her voice trembling with an eerie rasp. Her chair was positioned right in my path, and her gaze was locked onto me with an almost predatory intensity. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I heard her invite me to get closer. I hesitated, but her words grew more insistent. "Come closer, dear," she repeated, her voice carrying an unsettling tone. There was something profoundly disturbing about the way she spoke. Her giggle, low and hollow, sent a wave of dread through me. It wasn't a pleasant or playful sound. It was the kind of giggle that made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore her, quickening my pace, but her invitation was impossible to shake off. Her eyes followed me with a relentless focus, and her whispers grew louder, urging me to approach. The more I heard, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Her unsettling words and the sinister nature of her giggles made it clear that something was deeply wrong. My instinct was to avoid her, to find any way to escape the oppressive dread that clung to me every time I saw her. I started changing my walking routes, taking detours through different streets and parks, hoping to avoid her altogether. I varied my walking times too: morning, afternoon, evening, anything to keep my encounters with her to a minimum. Yet, no matter what I did, she always seemed to be there, sitting in her chair, closer than before, her gaze never wavering. Despite my efforts, the fear of encountering her was a constant shadow over my daily life. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always watching me, waiting for the right moment to pounce. It was as if my attempts to avoid her were futile, and every time I left my house, a nagging sense of paranoia followed me. My walks, once a source of relaxation and exercise, became a battleground of anxiety and fear. The fear grew more intense with each passing day. I couldn't stop imagining what might happen if I got too close to her. Her unsettling whispers and that cold, unblinking stare played on a loop in my mind, turning my once peaceful walks into a nightmare. I'd find myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at the slightest sound. My heart would race whenever I saw a shadow or heard a rustle, convinced that she was closing in on me. My anxiety began to seep into every part of my life. I struggled to focus at work, my sleep became fitful and plagued by nightmares of that old woman, and I avoided social interactions, preferring to stay in the safety of my home. The growing sense of dread was consuming me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting just around the corner. Eventually, the fear became too overwhelming. I knew I had to leave the neighborhood, to escape the constant terror that the old woman represented. I found a new place on the other side of town and packed up my things with a mix of relief and lingering dread. The thought of no longer having to face her gaze, to no longer hear her whispers, was a tremendous weight off my shoulders. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to reclaim my life from the nightmare that had taken over. Yet, even as I settled into my new home, the memories of the old woman haunted me. Her intense stare and those chilling whispers seemed to linger in the back of my mind, resurfacing in the dark corners of my thoughts. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or feeling a shiver run down my spine at the slightest sound. The trauma had left its mark, and it wasn't something I could easily leave behind. Then, months after moving, I stumbled across a news report that sent a shiver down my spine. The headline read, "Local woman arrested for kidnapping." I clicked on the article, and my heart dropped as I read about the old woman, the one who had plagued my walks for so long. The report detailed how she had been caught trying to kidnap someone, and how authorities believed she had been planning to abduct others. It turned out I hadn't been the only one to sense something wrong. Her sinister plans had been far more dangerous than I could have imagined. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had narrowly escaped becoming one of her victims. The fear that had once felt like paranoia was now confirmed as a genuine threat. It was a grim reminder of how close I had come to a nightmare becoming reality. Even now, the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't managed to avoid her sends chills through me. I can't help but wonder about the other people who might have been targeted and how lucky I was to have escaped her clutches. As I read the news report, it hit me just how fortunate I had been to escape the old woman's grasp. The chilling details of her arrest, her plans for more victims, it all made me realize just how close I had come to becoming one of her targets. The fear that had plagued my walks, the anxiety that gnawed at me day and night, suddenly seemed like a grimly accurate premonition. I had managed to avoid a terrifying fate, and the relief was both profound and unsettling. Even so, the aftermath of those encounters continues to weigh heavily on me. The old woman's presence left a lasting scar on my psyche. The anxiety that once consumed me hasn't completely faded, Instead, it lingers, a shadow that I can't seem to shake off. I find myself constantly on edge, more aware of my surroundings than I ever was before. The fear of encountering something, or someone, like her again has become a part of my daily life. Looking back on those eerie experiences, I can't help but reflect on the unsettling knowledge that I narrowly avoided becoming one of her victims. The old woman, with her intense stare and haunting whispers, was more than just a strange neighbor. She was a real, terrifying threat, and my close call with her serves as a chilling reminder of how real danger can sometimes lurk in the most unexpected places. I still think about what might have happened if I hadn't been so vigilant, and that thought alone is enough to send a shiver down my spine.